Strasvoja, and welcome to episode 19 of my Soviet Union vlog. And at the point where I'm kind of wishing I hadn't done the Russian greeting at the start. Today we're cracking on to theme 4, which is about social security, and looking at how social security changed and developed all the way through the period from 1917 to 85. Let me just read the example spec for this bit. It talks about full employment, housing, and social benefits. The ways in which communist rule improved the lives of the Soviet people, and the failures of government policy. So they're really steering you towards two types of question there. Those latter 2 points, the ways in which communist rule improved the lives of people and the failures of government policy, clearly there's a contrast to be done there between succeeding or not succeeding in improving lives. And really, it kind of does succeed, but you're going to be thinking about the extent to which that success happens. And then, secondly, that first bit, full employment, housing, and social benefits gives you the opportunity perhaps to compare and contrast the role of each of those areas, subsets, within this idea of social security. That's probably the harder question there than the straightforward success failure one. So let's just have a look at what happens here. And of course, this is within theme 4, so they might ask you to compare, or might open up the way to compare to other parts of theme 4 as well. So in terms of employment and social benefits, starting at the beginning, under war communism, very quickly after the revolution, work was made compulsory. The Bolshevik party at that time didn't have any ability to kind of let people not work, and so they made everyone work or fight. Every citizen between 16 and 50 years old had to fight or work, and food and fuel were immediately seized by the state and rationed. Housing and transport were made free in urban areas. Laundries and creches were provided as well. But, of course, although the state takes a massive role in this and tries to control all of this area, rations are too small. They are given out according to your role in society. And the urban population fell by 25% during the Civil War as people left to find food. And that brings about the whole crisis, which leads to the NEP. So after the Civil War, unemployment rose due to demobilization, people leaving the army to go back to their regular lives. Free creches were abolished, making it harder for women to work. And that reflects as quite a conservative attitude amongst communist leaders towards women in work. So that by 1924, 18% of the urban workforce was unemployed. By 1926, 1 million people were unemployed. But under the NEP, real wages grew for those who were in work, so that was good. And it was better for skilled workers. What that actually meant, there was a increase in the wage differential, the gap between poorer workers, poorer unskilled workers, and those skilled workers who were earning more. In the 1920s, Social Security was launched with disability, maternity, unemployment, and medical benefits. Billed at the time as the most comprehensive system in the world, covering 9 million urban workers, but not peasants at all, and of course not all urban workers. Education investment was also up in the 20s, but we'll come back to that in a different theme. So under Lenin, a start is made, definite intent, ideological intent, but patchy in its success. Stalin brought back compulsory employment with the 5-year plans. And in 1930, the Soviet Union became the first country in the world to achieve full urban employment. Hired workers increased from 11.6 million in 1926 to 27 million in 1937, so more than doubling. And also the benefits increased too. Food rations were provided, factory canteens were installed for workers. In the 30s, the metro was constructed in Moscow. And over 30,000 kilometres of railway were installed, so transport became easier and very cheap, if not free, for workers. And vaccines for typhus and malaria were available to all citizens by 1947. The number of doctors increased from 70,000 in 1928 to 155,000 in 1940. And the number of hospital beds rose from 247,000, so almost 250,000 in 1928, to 791,000 in 1939. So number of doctors more than doubled. between 28 and 40, and the number of hospital beds more than tripled in the similar sort of time frame. But under Stalin, labour discipline was very harsh. Serious penalties for absenteeism or for for not working hard enough, not meeting a quota. The quality of food provided was often terrible, as in not fit for human consumption, led to illness. Factories were unhealthy places, outbreaks of lice, dysentery, vomiting. Unemployment benefit was cancelled in 1930 because nobody was unemployed. But of course, there were people who, a few people here and there were temporarily unemployed, even in full employment countries. And growing disaffection during the 5-year plans for various reasons, so that in 1932, internal passports were issued, and these were required to change job. But even so, and to try and the idea was to encourage stability and to keep people in place. Even so, in 1937, 30% of all urban workers changed their jobs because they were dull and repetitive. And to combat this, of course, you get the Stakhanovite movement, things around that where wage differentials were increased. There was an attempt to provide incentive for workers. Even that didn't work. So that absenteeism, missing work for no good reason, was made a criminal offence in 1939. It should also be noted that peasants miss out on all of this. No rations, no benefits. They just have to work hard in their collective farms. Just quick note about housing up to in the Lenin and Stalin years up to the Second World War, continual problem throughout really the whole Soviet Union, but definitely in this period. In the 1920s, they tried to get around that by redistributing housing from the wealthy to the poor, particularly housing that had been built under the Tsar. Under Stalin, you get a massive growth in the urban population. For instance, the population of Moscow almost doubled from 2.2 million in 1929 to 4.1 million in 1936. The population of Leningrad, similar, 1.6 million in 1926, 3.4 million in 1939. And there wasn't enough urban housing. So houses were divided up into communal apartments. Whole families ended up living in one room. They were, in fact, a little bit lucky if they got one room. In some areas, places like Magnitogorsk, which was built pretty much from scratch, these new factory towns, you often have to live in barracks for workers. So lots of people sleeping in big rooms. But there weren't enough beds in any case. In the Moscow coal fields, dormitories held 15,000 beds, but there were 26,000 workers. So housing was a big problem in these new urban centres. In 1936, only 6% of rented units had more than one room. 24% were only part of one room. So your family might end up living in a one room that was shared with another family or even more than one other family. 5% of renters in 1936 lived in a kitchen or a corridor. A quarter were living in dormitories, which is problematic if you had a family, of course. But it was cheap. Only 8% of income was spent on accommodation. The Second World War, of course, makes this whole problem much worse. Stalingrad is perhaps an anomaly, but lost 90% of its housing. Leningrad lost a third of its housing, and everything kind of west of Moscow was severely damaged and dislocated due to the Nazi invasion. So that's up to 1953 and the death of Stalin. Under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they remain very committed to this idea of social security. Khrushchev introduced the minimum wage, or a minimum wage to keep people out of poverty in 1956. In 1957, he introduced a shorter working week and increased paid holidays. Spending on healthcare was doubled in the 50s, and the pension budget was quadrupled between 1950 and 1965. In 1961, Khrushchev said that citizens should finally enjoy the benefits of socialism and launched a range of benefits, including free lunches in schools, offices and factories, free public transport, free pensions and healthcare for farmers. Farmers. As a result, the death rate decreased from 9.7 per thousand in 1950 to 7.3 per thousand in 1965, and infant mortality dropped dramatically from 81 per thousand in 1950 to 27 per thousand in 1965. We'll come back a little bit to healthcare later on. Housing was a big priority for Khrushchev, particularly after the Second World War. He built new accommodation K7 housing blocks. You might have heard of these. We mentioned them in a previous vlog. They were nicknamed the Khrushchevka, which means the Khrushchev slums. They were prefabricated, low quality, bog standard housing units, but they did give a family a whole apartment each with running water and central heating. So they're a big upgrade on what they'd had under Stalin. Construction of the of the housing apartments was supposed to be temporary, but it continued through the 70s and 80s, and actually was quite a lot of nostalgia for them even later than that. Brezhnev continues along a similar sort of line. He has this idea of developed socialism. That's his kind of propaganda phrase, but it kind of reflects his thoughts about how society should work. And he certainly had the idea. I don't think he probably didn't speak this out loud, maybe, but the idea of a social contract. But in essence, that the government would continue to strive to raise living standards in return for the support of the people, and that this idea that if they did that, then both sides would be kind of happy. So Brezhnev guaranteed job security and full employment under the 1977 constitution. He guaranteed low prices for essential goods. He didn't guarantee, but in actual fact it happened, that there was no government interference in the second economy, the black market. There was free healthcare, heavily subsidised rents, electricity, water bills, holidays were subsidised, increase in spending on healthcare and pensions and welfare spending as a whole. Welfare spending as a whole increased 500% between 1950 and 1980. So this is a serious commitment by the Soviet governments. Healthcare grew substantially between 1950 and 1980s across the whole Khrushchev and Brezhnev period, and just the tail end of Stalin too. The quality was much more variable, but there was access to healthcare. In 1978, there were over 2,000 sanatoria in the Soviet Union. These are like rest homes with medical facilities, and over 1,000 rest homes linked to medical care. Workers were encouraged to go to sanatoria and these rest homes for a variety of conditions, from high blood pressure to heart problems and stomach complaints. Much better provision, though, in urban areas, and particularly Western Soviet urban areas. Central Asia was served particularly badly. Some hospitals, even into the 1980s, had no heating or running water. So it is quite variable depending on where you live. But nevertheless, there's an intent there. The social contract was generally successful. Living standards did rise. People accepted the regime, didn't really oppose it too much. I've got a couple of examples of minor stuff later on. Real wages increased 50% between 1967 and 77, and wage differentials were less than half that of those in the USA in 1970. So wages were going up, and the gap between rich and poor was not growing. It remained minimal for modern countries. But there were downsides. Job satisfaction was low. It's difficult to dismiss a lazy or incompetent worker in the Brezhnev era. Brezhnev was quite conservative socially, so women struggled to get into work. And the pension rate was really low, too low to live on. So about 40 rubles per month in 1980. So many retired people continued to work part-time, and in particular, winter snow street cleaners were recruited from the elderly. Peasants only gained a pension at all in the Brezhnev era, so that's a slight kind of, is a glass half full or half empty. And similarly, their wages were still 10% lower than workers in the 1970s. But again, that gap had closed from earlier on, so you might see that as positive, but it's still 10% behind. Life expectancy for men also dropped from 68 to 64 in the 1970s. The main cause of that was alcoholism. There's some stats on that for you. The Soviet population grew 25% between 1940 and 1980, but alcohol consumption increased by 600%. There was an estimated 20 million alcoholics in the Soviet Union by 1987. Also, it should be noted that party membership was key to advancement. This is the idea of the nomenclatura, where you had to kind of be on a party list to get a good job. Party membership grew from 6.9 million in 1953 to 17 million in 1980. By the end of the 70s, 20% of all males over 30 were party members. But of course, that means that even by the end of the 1970s, 80% of males over 30 were not party members and were therefore denied some of these sort of extra benefits, job security and promotion prospects that the party members did have. Protest, as I mentioned, was rare, and that both shows that not everyone was satisfied, but also that most people were satisfied. The four examples for you, probably all from the textbook, I think. Temeratu In Kazakhstan, Temiratu is spelled Temiratu. In 1959, young workers in Temiratu burnt down the workplace canteen and hanged the local police chief in protest to East German and Polish immigrant workers being paid more. In Novocherkassk in 1962, Novocherkassk is spelled Novocherkassk. 70 people were killed in sort of riots and protests following a rise in meat and dairy prices. And that actually coincided with the local factory chief, for some reason, reducing wages. So that was kind of a perfect storm there. As a result, also, Khrushchev and the government did send extra supplies to Novocherkassk, but 70 people were killed. There were riots and strikes in Sverdlovsk in 1969 and Gorky in 1980 as well. But overall, the pattern here would be that things do improve and they do grow, and the Soviet Union government does pay attention to social security and does a good job at providing for people. But the two main things you would say was that the quality of provision was low, and so the increase was lagging behind Western European and American increases. And eventually, as people work that out, see that gap as communication becomes better, that causes a massive problem for the Soviet Union's government, because the population stopped believing in the Soviet Union and stopped trusting their government. And also, you'd say even within the Soviet Union, that things are improving most for you if you're a male urban party member of working age. If you are outside of that, then things aren't quite so good for you. So women, not quite so good. Non-party members, not quite so good. Rural citizens, not so good. And I should also add that if you're in the Central Asian republics rather than in the Western European republics of the Soviet Union, you're probably also not seeing quite such good benefits of the system. I hope that helps. And next time we'll be looking at the status of women in the Soviet Union. See you then.